Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. A winter flat in Arklow, lights on, furniture shoved into angles that don't belong in a family home. The noise neighbors heard wasn't confusion, it was impact. When first responders crossed the threshold on Emmett Place, the room started talking before anyone else did. Low-level impact marks on a wall, shelving forced out of line, a kitchen floor carrying the signature of a sustained assault. No speculation was needed. In towns like this, crimes don't just wound a person, they strain the fabric of a quiet community. And when the data lines up too neatly, investigators learn to ask why. The victim was identified as Nadine Lott, 30, a beautician and young mother known in Arklow for her work and presence. She was still alive when crews arrived, critical but alive. Paramedics initiated rapid stabilization and transport while Gardaí locked down the apartment. From the start, the approach was strict. One primary scene, a single point of entry consistent with someone known to the victim, and no evidence of an unknown intruder forcing a door or window. The kitchen living area became a controlled grid, photographs at fixed angles, scale rulers against the wall, swabs taken from patterned and pooled areas, and every movement logged to preserve chain of custody. For viewers used to television shortcuts, here's what matters in real investigations: geometry and chronology. Geometry said the first blows likely began near the doorway and carried the struggle inward, not a brief scuffle, but a series of impacts that left transfer and distortion in predictable places. Chronology said it happened in a narrow window in the early hours of December 14, 2019. No alarm, no break-in call, just neighbors reacting to sounds that escalated past any domestic argument they'd heard before. Back at the hospital, physicians initiated massive transfusion protocols. At the scene, a senior Garda walked the apartment again, lights off, then on, to verify whether shadows could have concealed a second attacker. They couldn't. A scene like this narrows rather than widens. It pointed to proximity, familiarity, and time spent inside the room. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, because clean alignment invites rationalizations. It was sudden. It was the substances. It wasn't meant. The physical record resisted that story. We won't jump ahead. At this stage, the case file read serious assault, upgraded to suspected homicide if the worst happened at the hospital. The investigator's task was to protect the record. That meant no grand theories, no drift into motive, and no public naming. Just one apartment, one timeline, and one victim fighting for her life. The hospital phase turned a violent scene into a verified sequence. Nadine Lott arrived in extremis in the early hours of December 14, 2019. A massive transfusion protocol activated within minutes. Surgical and ICU teams recorded time-stamped interventions, airway, lines, imaging, and damage control procedures. Those entries mattered because they locked the assault to a narrow window and confirmed scale, approximately 42 units of blood products in the first 24 hours. That figure isn't drama, it's a measure of sustained injury. A Garda liaison gathered precise hospital times, ambulance handover, first CT, first incision, medication administration, with the same discipline used at the apartment. Nothing in the clinical record suggested a second location, a later event, or an unknown intruder. Treatment artifacts were photographed so courtroom exhibits could distinguish medical intervention from injury. Chain of custody covered clothing, swabs retained in the ED, and any statements relevant to access or identity captured during care. By day 2, the chart showed the pattern common in fatal assaults: brief stabilization, then recurrent instability despite maximum support. Consultants documented guarded to poor prognosis in standard language. That language, careful and clinical, also serves an evidentiary role. Cause of death has to join the dots between trauma described at scene and the physiological failure recorded in ICU. Here, the dots joined. The timeline was continuous from apartment to theater to intensive care. Investigators didn't use this period to push motive. They used it to test whether any alternative mechanism could explain the injuries: accidental fall, short altercation, third-party entry. The files didn't support those options. Scene geometry indicated close quarters, prolonged violence. The medical record reflected the same. When two independent datasets point one way, the strategy isn't to speculate. It's to preserve the alignment for court. On December 17, 2019, Nadine died. The Garda file upgraded to homicide. Post-mortem authorization issued. From that point, the medical record became a bridge document, minute-by-minute proof linking what neighbors heard to what the jury would later evaluate. If you're following the build, the apartment gave origin, the hospital supplied continuity, and the post-mortem would define mechanism with finality. There's a human line worth stating without theatrics. Families are briefed in careful, factual terms because certainty matters. Viewers often ask whether 4 days later weakens causation. It doesn't here. The chart confirms continuous critical status from arrival to death. The interventions demonstrate severity, not doubt. In practical terms, that pushed the investigation away from what happened and toward who had the access and time to do it. When detectives turned from the operating theater to the living record of Nadine Lott's life, they weren't looking for drama, they were looking for access. Who could enter that apartment without delay? Who had reason to be there at that hour? The first answers came from people who didn't speak in abstractions: family, close friends, neighbors who had watched the relationship rise and stall over years. The pattern was consistent: an on-off partnership that had ended before December 2019. Boundaries stated, boundaries tested. No one needed to guess how a known person might cross a threshold in the early hours. The question now was whether the documents matched the talk. Officers assembled the immediate perimeter of facts. Statements placed the former partner in Nadine's orbit that week, frustrated by the breakup and attempting contact. Several accounts described recent attempts to talk things through, which at street level usually means unannounced visits, texts, calls. Investigators requested communications records through standard legal channels, recent call activity, message timing, and contact attempts. The goal was not content, it was sequence. If a phone lit up near the time neighbors heard escalation, that mattered. If messages clustered, then stopped, that mattered. The absence of further contact after the critical window also mattered, because silence after a burst can signal the pivot from pursuit to flight. Parallel to records, Gardaí mapped physical presence. Door-to-door canvas work produced short, factual notes: a sighting near Emmett Place earlier in the evening, a vehicle known to associates parked within walking distance on other nights that week, a relative who recalled Nadine stating the relationship was over. These are small pieces on their own. Together, they frame opportunity. The apartment did not point to a stranger who randomly selected a target. It pointed toward someone known who could sustain time inside a small room. Access was not only possible, it was ordinary until it wasn't. Then there was what happened after. Shortly following the time neighbors reported disturbance, the person of interest was involved in a single-vehicle crash. First responders who dealt with that crash documented remarks that aligned with an assault having taken place moments or minutes before. Those utterances weren't polished and they weren't prompted. They were the kind of statements people make when they think they're speaking into the void. Medics passed the information to Gardaí, who secured custody once treatment allowed. In investigation, post-event behavior is its own data set: distance traveled, route choice, condition of clothing, and unsolicited words. None of it replaces forensics. All of it helps prioritize suspects. With Nadine's death on December 17th, the inquiry formally shifted to homicide. Detectives tightened the timeline with institutional timestamps: ambulance arrival, hospital intake, operative starts, then set them next to neighborhood reports and the crash records. The chronology offered no space for an unknown third party to intervene between the apartment and the crash. It also challenged any claim that what happened in the apartment was a brief, mutual altercation. The distribution of injuries and the medical course you heard in the last segment undercut that narrative before anyone addressed motive. The relationship file came next. It covered years, not weeks. When the couple first met, the periods they lived together or apart, and the cadence of reconciliation and separation. The last phase mattered most. Friends described Nadine as firm that the relationship had ended. The former partner did not accept that finality. Courts later used the word diluted to describe his view of the status. Investigators avoided labels and stayed with verifiable behaviors: attempted contact, presence near the home, and escalating persistence despite clear boundaries. When you map those behaviors against a fixed crime window, you're not writing a theory. You're reducing the field. No one in the room pretended this was new. Intimate partner violence investigations are built on the same two questions every time: who had access and who refused the end of access. Arklow isn't unique in that way. What stands out here is how quickly the practical work closed the gap between suspicion and proof. By the time custody interviews began, detectives weren't seeking a confession to make the case. They were testing the suspect's account against a timeline that already fit, minute by minute, without him. There's a second human track to all of this, and it deserves one clean sentence. Boundaries don't keep people safe unless the people around them take those boundaries seriously. Friends who walk someone to a door, neighbors who call in unusual noise, officers who document small things precisely. Those inputs become the difference between a story that drifts and a record that holds. As the file advanced, prosecutors were briefed on the relationship history, the access pattern, the post-incident crash, and the remarks captured during medical contact. Formal charging decisions would follow established procedures, but the direction was clear. This was not a case waiting on a mysterious third lead. It was a case narrowing around a former partner whose presence, opportunity, and post-event conduct aligned with the sequence established in the first two chapters. Identity would be addressed by name at the opening of trial. Until then, the integrity of the build mattered more than any reveal. Back at the scene, the apartment changed from a room with damage to a measurable record. Technicians worked a fixed grid, then broke it down by patterns. Swabs from patterned areas were separated from swabs taken near transfer marks. Each sample got a barcode, a map coordinate, and a chain of custody line. Later in the lab, those coordinates would be paired with angles and heights to answer three questions: how long the assault lasted, where it started, and how far the assailant moved inside that room. Directionality came first. Analysts documented low-angle impacts near the entry zone and a denser field closer to the kitchen floor. That's not a flourish, it's geometry. When impacts begin at standing height and end near ground level, you are watching progression. The sequence pointed to initial blows close to the doorway, followed by a collapse toward the kitchen area where the contact continued. The absence of high-velocity patterns typical of a projectile event helped exclude a weapon of that category. This was close-quarters, repeated force. Cast-off analysis was limited by the room's size, but the lab still pulled value from edge artifacts on shelving and baseboards. Those edges carried short, arcing marks that repeated in the same plane, evidence of multiple swings in a narrow arc. That plane was consistent with a right-handed assailant working within a tight radius. No one labeled it as a certainty. It was logged as probability attached to angle and spacing. The point is simple: repeated motion, not a single chaotic strike. Transfer told the second half of the story. Along the path from the door to the kitchen floor, examiners recorded contact smears at heights that matched body carry rather than dragging. That matters. Dragging patterns leave continuous, low, lateral transfer. Carry leaves staggered, broken contact where skin or fabric meets surfaces during movement. Those discontinuous marks were present. The conclusion wasn't dramatic, it was practical. The victim moved or was moved in stages between impact cycles, not removed from the scene or transported elsewhere. Footwear was less direct. There wasn't a perfect outsole print to match to a brand, but there were partials, pressure ovals and edge fragments near the transition zone. Lab work focused on whether those fragments overlapped, indicating pacing within a small footprint rather than directional exit. They did. The overlay looked like someone turning back into the room repeatedly. Investigators compared the spacing to the room's dimensions and confirmed what the geometry already implied. Time was spent inside the kitchen area after the initial contact. Swabs taken from prominent patterns returned what you would expect at this stage in a domestic interior. The victim's profile across multiple coordinates. That's not headline material, but it is a control. You know the map is honest when it shows you what must be true. The more important outcome was what the map didn't show in quantity. Foreign biological material from an unknown third party. Background DNA consistent with household life was present in trace amounts. Nothing suggested a second assailant or a stranger's prolonged presence. Combined with the entry findings, no forced lock failure, no broken frame, the lab record reinforced access by someone known to the victim. A small but telling detail came from luminol-assisted mapping along the base of the counter. Within a compact area, analysts identified micro-patterns consistent with interrupted impacts, brief pauses between cycles. That aligns with sequences where an assailant stops, adjusts position, then resumes. In investigative terms, it pushes back on claims of a momentary row gone wrong. Interruption implies control. Control implies time to decide whether to continue. For viewers who follow true crime closely, This is where speculation often races ahead to motive. The file didn't do that. The lab stuck to physics and biology. The room showed sustained force and movement within a confined footprint. The biology map narrowed the field to people with authorized or familiar access. The entry hardware, intact, made the pool smaller. In a town like Arklow, that's not an abstract deduction, it's a finite list of names known to the victim and her circle. The human element belongs here too, briefly and plainly. Scenes like this are hardest on families because they translate love into coordinates and stains. Yet that translation has a purpose. It keeps the case from drifting into opinion. It protects the record. And it gives a jury something they can trust when stories change. The lab packet went back to detectives with 3 operational takeaways. The assault began near the entry zone and progressed inward. It continued in cycles at floor level, and no third-party biological profile suggested a stranger inside the apartment for any meaningful duration. With Nadine Lott's death now certified, those findings would be set next to the medical record and the access timeline you heard earlier. The next task wasn't to imagine why this happened. It was to test the suspect's eventual account against measurements that don't move. The arrest path began at a roadside ditch, not a station desk. Minutes after the assault window, the former partner crashed a car. First responders stabilized him and recorded spontaneous remarks that referenced an assault and a woman. Those words were not the case. They were the trigger for custody. Gardaí took over at the hospital once treatment allowed, noted visible condition, and logged clothing. Each step, medical clearance, transfer, caution, was time-stamped to preserve the interview record against later challenges. Inside custody, investigators didn't argue with him. They compared what he volunteered to what the room had already shown. He said he'd been drinking, maybe more. Intoxication claims aren't evaluated by tone. They're tested against fixed measurements. The scene map documented progression from the doorway to the kitchen area with repeated cycles at floor level. That geometry suggested time and control, not a single flash. If the account proposed a brief scuffle, it had to answer the intervals the lab identified near the base of the counter, those short pauses that read like someone stopping and resuming. Investigators let the suspect talk, then asked for specifics. When contact started, where the first impact occurred, how long he remained inside. Small inconsistencies matter more than volume. They reveal what doesn't match physics. Chain of custody moved in parallel. Clothing went into separate paper bags, air-dried, sealed, and logged. Swabs from the suspect's hands were collected per protocol. A medical blood draw, taken primarily for treatment, was documented and later subpoenaed within legal procedure. None of this presupposed guilt. It established a baseline that either aligned with the scene or didn't. Post-incident behavior was evaluated the same way. The crash site was mapped for route choice and timing. The absence of any effort to summon help at the apartment, followed by spontaneous statements at the crash, suggested the timeline moved from assault to flight, not from accident to discovery. With Nadine Lott's death certified on December 17, 2019, the legal posture changed. The initial serious assault charge gave way to a homicide file. Detectives briefed prosecutors on the lab packet, the ICU chronology, the access history, and the custody statements. The framework was simple: opportunity, proximity, and a room that spoke in measurements. The defense narrative forming through counsel hinted at intoxication and loss of control. Ireland's courts don't accept intoxication as a blanket eraser of intent. The evidence still has to be weighed. And evidence here didn't suggest a single chaotic burst. It outlined cycles, movement inside a tight footprint, and a suspect whose account shortened what the room recorded. One more discipline point. Investigators avoided motive in the interview room. They didn't coach remorse or press for speculation. They asked verifiable questions that could survive court, distance, timing, sequence. The suspect's answers set up the next stage. A jury would later hear whether those answers matched the geometry in the hospital clock. In cases like this, restraint is its own skill. It protects the file from contamination and prevents the story from splitting into two incompatible arcs. There's a narrow human note worth keeping. Accountability arrives through process. The medic who writes down the remark, the officer who seals a bag, the supervisor who checks the time. Families don't see those steps, but they're the reason a verdict means what it says. In a quiet town, process is how a community draws a straight line from a room to a courtroom. When the file reached Dublin's Central Criminal Court, identity moved from former partner to the name on the charge sheet, Daniel Murtaugh. He pleaded not guilty to murder, offering guilty to manslaughter on grounds of intoxication. From this point, every fact ran under oath. The jury's task was narrow: weigh the fixed measurements against a claim that he was too impaired to form intent. The prosecution opened with the scene and medical bridge already established in this series, but now through sworn witnesses. A senior paramedic described arriving to a confined interior with catastrophic injuries and immediate life-threatening blood loss. His language was clinical: airway, access, volume, transport. A responding Garda followed with the containment protocol: photographs taken before movement, swabbing sequences, and a running log of who crossed the threshold and when. Those two witnesses did only what they were supposed to do: set the bookends of the night without opinion so the specialists could fill the middle. Forensic analysts then translated the apartment into measurements. Directionality showed first impacts near the entry zone and continued contact at floor level in cycles, not a single burst. Transfer patterns matched staged movement rather than removal or dragging to a second location. DNA from patterned areas reflected the victim's profile as expected for a domestic interior of this size. No unknown third-party biological profile emerged to suggest a stranger in the room. The entry hardware, intact, aligned with access by someone known. Each point connected to a photographic panel and a lab identifier to avoid speculation. The forensic pathologist gave the medical core. Cause of death was certified as a result of multiple blunt force injuries with associated complications. The ICU course, massive transfusion within the first 24 hours, repeated procedures, and continuous critical status was used to anchor causation to what happened in the apartment in the early hours of December 14, 2019. Cross-examination probed whether a brief, chaotic altercation could produce the pattern described. The answer was measured. The distribution and severity were consistent with sustained close-quarters violence over time. On the intoxication issue, the court heard two kinds of evidence. First, clinical readings and observations taken when Murtaugh was treated after the single vehicle crash that followed the assault window. Second, the geometry of the room. The prosecution argued that voluntary intoxication does not erase intent where conduct demonstrates purpose and persistence. The defense pressed the idea that impairment negated murder. The jury watched as analysts overlaid timing, movement cycles, and pauses documented by interrupted patterns at the base of the counter. Those interruptions mattered. They implied decision points, not a single uncontrolled swing. Custody witnesses were brief and practical. Clothing was seized, air-dried, and sealed. Hand swabs were taken per protocol. Spontaneous remarks at the crash scene were admitted through the medic who heard them, with limiting instructions from the judge. Route and timing from the apartment to the ditch matched a sequence that moved from assault to flight, not from accident to discovery. None of these elements decided the case alone. Together, they narrowed the plausible explanations to one. There was a short human beat, and it belonged to the victim's family, present in court as the facts were recited. The tone in the room stayed professional because it had to. That professionalism is part of accountability. It prevents a case from turning into competing stories and keeps the focus on what can be proved. By the end of the first phase, the jury had a complete evidentiary chain. A single Arklow apartment as the only scene, a medical record that never broke continuity from arrival to December 17, 2019, and a defendant whose explanation had to fit a map that did not move. The court adjourned with instructions on law that the panel would later apply. What intoxication can and cannot do to intent under Irish standards. Deliberations began with precise directions from the judge. Voluntary intoxication could be considered, but it did not automatically erase intent. The jury had to decide whether the conduct inside the Arklow apartment showed purpose and persistence beyond a momentary loss of control. They carried back into the room only what was sworn in front of them: scene geometry, medical continuity, post-incident behavior, and custody documentation. No speculation, no theories, just the fixed record. They reviewed the paramedics' timeline and the responding Garda's scene preservation log, both built to minute marks. They revisited the laboratory panels that mapped the assault from the entry zone toward the kitchen floor. Directionality and interrupted cycles suggested decision points rather than a single uncontrolled burst. The forensic pathologist's testimony linked death on December 17, 2019 to injuries from the early morning assault on December 14th with a critical care course that never broke continuity. On a separate screen, counsel replayed the route from apartment to roadside ditch, the crash that followed the assault window, and the spontaneous remarks documented by medics. Each piece was small, standing alone. Together, they formed a sequence that didn't shift when challenged. Defense counsel pressed impairment. They argued intoxication diminished capacity to form intent, and that chaos can look like control when measured after the fact. The prosecution returned to conduct. They noted the intact entry hardware consistent with known access, the absence of an unknown third party's biological profile, the repeated impact cycles in a confined footprint, and the lack of any attempt to summon help from the apartment before flight. The point wasn't to inflame, it was to show that the room behaved like a closed system with one assailant who stayed long enough to move, stop, and continue. Over 2 days, jurors asked for limited readbacks. They wanted the exact wording on intoxication, a portion of the forensic pathologist's evidence on mechanism and duration, and a segment of the analyst's explanation of interrupted patterns at floor level. No one asked for motive, the instructions didn't require it. The question was simpler: did the actions described amount to murder under Irish law, or had the defense created enough doubt to reduce culpability to manslaughter? On August 5, 2021, the jury returned guilty of murder. The foreperson's words were brief and final. The court recorded the verdict. The judge thanked the panel for service. In that instant, the case moved from dispute to judgment. The defense request to treat intoxication as a shield had been weighed and rejected. What carried the day wasn't any single exhibit. It was how each data set, scene, lab, ICU, custody, and crash, confirmed the others. The file held its shape. For a family in the gallery, clarity matters. A verdict does not restore a life, but it fixes the public record. It states in law what the measurements had said from the beginning. This was sustained, close-quarters violence by a person with access to the victim's home. In towns like Arklow, where private life and community overlap, that clarity is part of how people understand what happened and why boundaries and early intervention matter. The court set October 4, 2021 for sentencing. Victim impact statements would be prepared. Counsel would address the court on the appropriate penalty under Irish law. Outside the courtroom, reporters confirmed the timeline that has anchored this series. Assault in the early hours of December 14, 2019, death on December 17th, and now a murder verdict that would shape the final 2 stages: sentence and appeal. There was no second ending on the horizon, only the closing of a process built to be exact. In Dublin's Central Criminal Court, judgment moved from verdict to consequence. On October 4, 2021, the court imposed life imprisonment on Daniel Murtagh for the murder of Nadine Lott in Arklow, County Wicklow, Ireland. The hearing was methodical. The prosecution summarized the jury's finding and referenced the gravity established at trial. The defense spoke to mitigation already on the record. The judge's remarks were brief but clear. The conduct met the highest threshold under Irish law, and the appropriate penalty was life. Victim impact statements were read into the record. They did not attempt to relitigate the facts the jury had resolved. They documented loss, dates, birthdays, an empty place at a table, all the practical markers families carry forward after a homicide. The court kept the tone professional, the way Irish courts tend to do. That professionalism matters on a platform like this. It signals to the public that the penalty was not about anger. It was about law, proportionality, and accountability. Administrative details followed: custody status, credit for time on remand, and the formal recording of sentence. None of that changes the headline, but it's how a justice system stays exact. In true crime, the urge is to add color here. The better choice is to keep it straight. A life sentence means the case leaves the trial calendar and shifts to the appellate track, where only specific legal questions can reopen parts of the record. That track ended too. After filings and listings across the post-conviction period, the appeal was withdrawn on April 18, 2024. There was no new trial, no revised charge, no resentencing. The conviction and life sentence stand. For storytelling, this is the point where 2 endings sometimes get manufactured. One for court, one for commentary. We won't do that. There is one ending: guilty of murder, life imprisonment, appeal withdrawn. The record is settled. Closing a case like this does not require revisiting injuries, maps, or timestamps. The value now sits in what the file teaches without turning into a lecture. First, the risk around the end of a relationship is real. It isn't a slogan. Boundaries need witnesses, friends who take calls seriously, neighbors who report escalation, professionals who document precisely. Second, process is a kind of respect. The medic who wrote down a remark at a crash site, the officer who sealed a bag properly, the analyst who limited a conclusion to what the data would bear. Those steps kept this story from breaking into competing narratives and protected the family from a second harm. Doubt for doubt's sake. For the audience who has stayed through each stage, here's the through line in one sentence. A single interior scene in Arklow generated a chain of evidence strong enough to survive courtroom challenge and post-conviction review. That is what justice looks like when it's built on measurement instead of speculation. It doesn't offer recovery, no sentence ever does, but it does offer certainty. And certainty allows a community to say, with discipline, what happened, who is responsible, and how the law answered. As we end, we keep the focus where it belongs. Nadine Lott is more than a case name. Her life anchored this record, and her family's persistence ensured it reached a lawful conclusion. If you take anything forward, let it be practical. Respect stated boundaries, note patterns that escalate, and treat early intervention as a community job, not a private worry. In towns like Arklow or anywhere, those choices are the difference between seeing danger and proving it in time. As I close this case, here's what I carry forward. Safety isn't a slogan, it's a plan. When a relationship ends and boundaries are tested, tell someone, document everything, and act early. Communities save lives when neighbors speak up and friends walk each other to the door. That's how small choices become protection. What warning sign would you never overlook now? Where are you watching from? If this episode didn't land for you, tell me why and how you found it. If it did, share your take below. And if you see this video, please subscribe to Creepy Crime Story for the next case.